Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Backlog Banter video. My name is Sucker Hazel. Today, I am joined by my bingo-loving co-host, Abram Beener. Today, we're here to talk about another one of the 2023 Game of the Year nominees for Jeff Keighley's The Game Awards. This is Resident Evil 4 Remake, if you want to add the addendum, but the game officially is just known as Resident Evil 4, and because it just completely wipes away the other one from history, in my opinion. We're going to be talking about each of the categories that it's nominated in, especially as it being a Game of the Year nominee, how it stands in each of its categories, what its chances are of winning, and also just kind of our thoughts on the game generally, because we haven't had a chance to talk about it on this channel, and what it sort of stands for as a Game of the Year nominee, and what it brings to this year in terms of its narrative and design and all of that. And Abram, you and I are differing levels of Resident Evil fans, but you are very passionate about the original Resident Evil 4, and you were also on the train of being pretty skeptical that game needed a remake, and we got one in the vein of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, and now Resident Evil 4. And give me your thoughts on this game generally, and then sort of talk about it in the Game of the Year category. Also, feel free to read out the nominees if you want to just start there.
Yes, I'm going to pre-start by saying join the Discord, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, do all the YouTube stuff,
I did a little of this. It was so quick that you couldn't see it, but I transferred it directly.
Oh, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
My mind works slowly, so that's probably just
my super speed and also telepathy. Interesting combination there.
Fair enough. Game of the Year noms: Alan Wake 2, Baldur's Gate 3, Tears of the Kingdom, Spider-Man 2, Resident Evil 4, Mario Wonder. Now, you're totally right. I was very skeptical of this game before it came out, and even to go to a higher level, I'm kind of skeptical on the Resident Evil franchise in general. I've played a good number of the games. I'm largely indifferent towards the series.
You've played 2 Remake, Village 4 Remake, and a little bit of 1 Remake, right?
Yeah. I've played a pretty fair amount.
That's a solid chunk of the series.
Yeah, I found this. I found the snake crank handle or whatever, and put that in place, and etc.
Pretty sure that happens once in every Resident Evil game. You also played the Dark Side Chronicles on Wii.
I did. Yeah, that's a fun game. I also played about 10 minutes of Resident Evil Revelations, if that bumps up my credit at all. I also interviewed somebody who did a fan remake of Resident Evil Gaiden, so more credit for me, but. Yeah, Resident Evil 4 OG was definitely my favorite because that game has a very unique flavor, obviously, to even the rest of the series. Of course, it goes on to shape really 5 and 6 in a particular way. And it's, of course, widely considered to be one of the greatest games of all time. Of course, infamously, the big heavy hitter for GameCube that Capcom then decided about 9 months later, shit, we got to bring this to PS2. Nobody's buying it on GameCube. And if you can believe it, is. I love RE4, and my skepticism was largely that, you play RE1, you're like, oh, fuck, this needs a remake. And you can even make the argument that the remake needs a remake. But for my tastes, I think that RE4, even though it has a very particular feel and a very particular style, and is in some ways of its time, in some ways I think it also isn't. And so I was a little concerned about how the remake would... I don't want to say trample on that because that sounds like I'm being more pessimistic than I am.
Well, you might have
just
been.
Concerned
You're pretty pessimistic beforehand.
And that's fair enough. But the reality is that what we got as RE2 and RE3 are the new versions is far more of a reimagining than a remake. And I think it was fair to assume that 2 and 3 were that way because you're not going to make fixed camera PS1 style PS4 games, but. The reality is that was just sort of taking the series down a design path that 4 Remake also follows, and that it is very much in line with those and not very much concerned with replicating the feel of the original RE4. So I think the game is very different. Well, I don't think that. I know that. That's an objective fact. What I think is that it is as successful as the original, but just in different ways. I love the extremely heightened sense of action in the game. I think it has some really great small set pieces. There's a moment when you pick up a crank off a wall and 2 chainsaws shoot through the wall behind you. That's one of my favorite moments of the year. But I loved it. I really did love it. I blasted through the game in like 2 or 3 sittings. It's one of my favorites of the year. My favorite survival horror game of the year, which is a pretty high accolade in a year with a lot of really good ones. even another one that I love in Alan Wake 2. But this will be interesting to talk about, Tucker, because I think we're both quite effusive in our praise of the game. But I would say that it's a fair assessment of the field this year that RE4 Remake has become the most contentious game of the year.
Unless you're
nominee.
stupid and you're looking at Wonder. There are some stupid people being contentious about Wonder.
Yeah, but most of those people are also hashtag boycott the Game Awards, hashtag Starfield is actually good or whatever. That's what
I'm one of those two. I'll let you choose which one.
Sure. Take it away with your thoughts on RE4, and then we'll get into this whole controversy.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting conversation to have because I come down on the side that Resident Evil 4, GameCube, 2005 is a very good game. It is, I think, a solid step up in terms of reinventing that franchise and making it a lot more playable and bringing it action roots and putting it in a new location. Resident Evil 4, the original game, is a fantastic game, but it is one that I think does age in particular ways that hampered the experience for me. I enjoyed my time going through it, but having, instead of jumping off a cliff, you do a little quick time event cutscene. It's like, okay, that they had to load things. They couldn't have there's a lot of limitations that go into that game in terms of transitioning from tank controls. The way that you control Leon can be a little bit clunky and hard to get your head around. Some of the textures are very flat. Some of the enemy AI isn't very good. There's just a lot of things that are of the time because it is an older game and didn't have decades and decades of Resident Evil games and modern hardware to work off of. And I think it is good within its own bounds, but I was always on the side of there are some very clear things here from better atmospheric lighting to getting rid of those mini QuickTime events to tightening up the controls and adding a little bit more of the collection and exploration that the other games have included, that I'm like, this game can be made better. It has a very solid groundwork.
Sure.
And they blew me away with Resident Evil 4 Remake this year. I think this is one of the best games of the year. It feels so at home with the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes fitting in with 7 and Village. I think the greatest thing that I can say about this game is it really made me care about the bond between Leon Kennedy, the Resident Evil 4 Leon Kennedy, and Ashley. Something that I had pretty big problems with in the original version. I think they do a lot better characterization and bonding here, and their personalities shine through so much better. I think it's better boss fights. The added environments fit so well with what they've established. I think it's a phenomenal game. I mean, it's one of the best Resident Evil games. It's one of the best games of the year. And I, just like you, blasted through it in a couple days because while I think my only main problem with the game is it's too goddamn dark. I could not play the game during the daytime because at full brightness in the game and on my TV, I was bumping into things because I couldn't fucking see them. Other than that, I think it's one of the best games of the year, and in my opinion, not worthy of being nominated for Game of the Year because much like Resident Evil 2, this is a different game. It is built on bones, but I see it as less of a remake, but as you said earlier, a reimagining that brings that game forward to parity with current game design and feel, and I think it's equally as impressive that they were able to take something that did, in my opinion, feel very clunky and old, and make it fit in with Dead Space and Alan Wake today.
Yeah, let's zoom out for a second, just in case anybody is not familiar. Essentially, the controversy, if you want to call it that, is the notion of RE4 being a Game of the Year candidate while also being a remake. Now, I think we can really get into this on sort of a philosophical level and in the case of RE4, because frankly, the game is only nominated for 2 categories. And I think actually both would be quite quick to litigate.
It's 3, right? Am I off my record? Yeah, 3. Oh, outside of Game of the Year.
Well,
sure.
Game of the Year.
Yeah. Which, by the way, let's do the quick highlight. It maybe is the lowest chance of winning Game of the Year. I mean, out of all the 6 nominees, this is probably bottom.
Yeah.
So it's not going to win.
Yeah.
But I think it does add interesting texture to the Game of the Year conversation, which is, as you wanted to explain.
Yeah. Essentially, should a remake be up for Game of the Year? And now there's a couple. I've thought about this in a bunch of different ways. For a long time, falling on the side of, okay, well, it should be included because the game is pretty much is pretty fundamentally different. It is a reimagining. You wouldn't look at Resident Evil's, or sorry, you wouldn't look at Final Fantasy VII Remake, I don't think, and say, okay, that doesn't belong to be in there.
Absolutely.
And if you're not going to do that, right, why would you do the same for RE4? But then I say you shouldn't do the same for Metroid Prime Remaster. But the question becomes,
where's
then,
the line?
Why shouldn't you do? Yeah, why shouldn't you do that? Why are these okay? Why isn't this okay? What's the line? And I think that's what we can really get into, because I think that there is, at least from my perspective, no doubt that there is a more interesting sixth nominee in this field than RE4. I think Hi-Fi Rush is a great shout. I think Hi-Fi Rush deserved to probably be in this canon, but you can also look at something indie, whether that's Pizza Tower, or more realistically, Sea of Stars Cocoon. If you want to say Starfield, I even think Starfield is a more compelling nomination than this game in some respects. But that is if you're looking on to have the category either A, represent the larger field, or B, want to make this distinction about whether or not a remake should or shouldn't land in the category. So, thinking about this question, like high level, Tucker, remakes in the Game of the Year category, what's your gut level about this?
The line is wiggly. The line is hard to draw.
Yeah.
And for me, it comes down to if I have played the game and usually have, ideally would have some experience with the original game, just to be able to tell what the differences are, how differently it has been changed between its original and its remake. If those game changes are significant enough to make me feel like this was built through a modern game design philosophy, I'm like, that's ostensibly a new game. And I would really argue for games like RE2 and RE4 to be so reworked in terms of all new textures, all new story, all new voice acting, new areas, new controls, new side modes. Like, other than story and general area layout, that's all that carries over from that original game. So I think that from that lens, it is a 2023 game. It is built in that 2023 engine. It is built using texture and lighting and game design philosophy that we've learned from decades and decades of games for. And so from that lens, I say yes, Resident Evil 4 is not only deserves to be in this category because it's one of the best games of the year, but because the team that made this game is very different from the team that made that original game, and the changes that they made and the design that they brought to this made it a not only substantially different experience, but in my eyes, a modern experience. It feels of the moment. If you picked up Resident Evil 4 today without the knowledge that it was a remake of an older game, you wouldn't blink an eye at this being among one of the best games of the year. There wouldn't be that asterisk, because it's like, it looks just as good as all these other games, and it plays just as good as all these other games. And then when I think once you even compare it and you see the things that they've added and changed here, it has substantial enough changes to where, it feels like a perfectly solid Game of the Year candidate. And I would also argue that it's good to occasionally have a game of a remake type or reimagining type in this category, because that is a big part of what the games industry is nowadays. And if you want to reflect the current state of the industry and the best games across all fields and types of games coming out, I think a nominee in that area is warranted, not only because games like RE2, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and RE4 are some of the best games of the last few years, but because those kinds of games are popular and are influencing the way that we see the industry. And so having representation of that, again, only the best ones, I think is important for accurately reflecting. And I just don't see much of a benefit. I do see some benefit, but not much of a benefit to saying this game was based on an older game, so it can't be included, even though it is a great game that came out that year that from the ground up is a wholly built new game.
Yeah, it's interesting because when it comes to my personal list, right? I mean, on this channel, we do our list, our top, in this case, 23 games of 2023, and it can be anything that we played this year, one or another. So that's kind of my personal philosophy on things, right? I mean, spoiler alert, my list, there's really nothing else that's going to change my list this year, so I think my third favorite game of the year is Metroid Prime Remastered, right? Last of Us Part 1 was one of my favorite games of last year. And Last of Us Part 1 is a really interesting point for this conversation. Because Last of Us Part 1 obviously didn't get nominated. Last of Us Part 1 was widely criticized. But Last of Us Part 1 is also a very intentional, very exhaustive, from the ground up remake of The Last of Us. Now, it's tracking the same beats, the gameplay is the same, but in talking to the developers, not to toot my own horn, and there was a very particular artistic consideration for making a contiguous experience from part one, from the original to part one, and making very, very careful artistic decisions when recreating these environments about how new lighting technology allows them to push certain vignettes further. But when you push in one direction, if you don't pull in the other, you change the intent from what you're trying to accomplish. So if you want to think about pure technical achievement, Last of Us Part 1 could not exist any year other than any year before 2022. Yeah. It was also very, 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 very carefully considered and very carefully put together at a level of fidelity that few games in the entire history of the medium can even touch. And so this is where I think it starts to get muddy when we begin to make judgment calls about what is new. Absolutely. Because you can look at Last of Us Part 1 and say that there is nothing new about that game. But I think if you are thinking about Game of the Year as a celebration of the achievement of games from an artistic lens, a technical lens, a sort of cultural lens, whatever, there's a lot of great rationale for Part 1 to get nominated. But then the problem becomes, right, is it fair, quote unquote, to nominate Last of Us Part 1? Do you better represent the year with other games that might be of a lesser quality in terms of reception, in terms of fidelity, in terms of whatever, just because Last of Us Part 1 is old in some ways? The Oscars is an interesting parallel to this because remakes get nominated all the time for Best Picture. I mean, we just talked about All Quiet on the Western Front last year. We talked about West... Yeah, I mean, it's not a new phenomenon. So from my point of view, I think there needs to be a definitive decision made. Either you include remakes or you don't include remakes. Because I think it starts to get really tricky when you say, okay, RE4 plays differently, has different controls, it has different scenarios, thus it's fine. But The Last of Us Part 1, which does have new innovations in control and fidelity and accessibility, so on and so forth, that's worth less. And I think you can make a subjective argument if that's the case, but I think you start to devalue certain types of creativity and achievement when you say that. And so I don't actually know which side of that fence I would fall on if I was the Game of the Year voter. Should we include remakes? Should we not include remakes? But what I think I know in my core is that you must choose. I think that the wiggliness of the line makes a lot of sense in our minds, but I think that when you extrapolate that out and want to celebrate everything you can achieve in games and the work that goes into achieving that, it becomes too subjective to make the decision that RE4 passes the test, Last of Us doesn't, Metroid Prime doesn't.
I do agree, and the ultimate point that I think we're honing in on with the way you explain that is each person has to choose for themselves, but the reality is the line isn't wiggly, because the line is where what ends up getting nominated and what doesn't. That's where the line is, because that is the culmination of where everyone's line was, that when placed next to each other are all wiggly, but as they are averaged out becomes the solid line. Last of Us Part 1 was not nominated for Game of the Year, and frankly it wasn't really discussed in that Game of the Year conversation. And so on a cultural level and on a literally what was nominated level, the line is that didn't do enough new. And Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 4, and of course, and I would say even farther down the line is Final Fantasy VII Remake, those games do fall on the other side of it. And so I think I'm okay with the line being wiggly as it is and as this conversation evolves
Sure.
because we're pretty new, all things considered, into this kind of game being in the conversation or even really happening to the scale of effort and creativity that is being put in. I really do think RE2 Remake in 2019 is it being nominated was not only cool because that's a great game, but because that was one of the first major from the ground up remake games that completely reimagined what came before, or at least on that level of production value. And so it kind of represented an inflection point is the word I'm looking for. And I think it has become more acceptable and more popular to do these high fidelity reimaginings after that.
I mean, you can also make a great case in the example of Resident Evil 2 that there's a lot of games after it that owe its identity.
Oh, absolutely.
Alan Wake 2 is a great example. I don't think Alan Wake 2 plays the way it plays if Resident Evil 2 hadn't come up before it. I think... Well, let me ask you this, right? Because I think the point you raise about remakes... reimaginings, whatever word you want to put in there.
The definition of all of those, also wiggly.
Yeah.
Many a YouTube video essay has been made on this topic.
Yeah.
Hey, I watch them when they show up in my feed. Not gonna lie. I love watching people be like, I think this is a remake, and I think that's a reimagining. But actually, at the end of the day, no one knows, and then the video ends. Watch that for 45 minutes.
It's one of those topics. Yeah, it's one of those topics from like you are probably a really smart writer and it's probably a really well edited video. You have nothing new to say on the topic.
No fucking way.
So I just move on. But what do you make of the proposed solution that's been thrown out a lot of best remake as a category? What do you think about that as a solution? Take them out of Game of the Year, take them out of wherever, put them in this category.
I think that's a totally fine solution. I think that then does create other problems, but that comes with anything. Anytime you create a new rule, there's gonna be pros and cons to it, so then it ultimately comes down to what we think creates the least amount of friction or confusion. But I think that would be fine because remakes and remasters and reimagining are so popular nowadays that there are enough great ones to fill that category. Just this year, Mario RPG, Metroid Prime, Dead Space, and RE4 is a 4 nominee lineup of... People would argue some of the best games ever made, those 4 games. So that would be awesome. But then the line then becomes, okay, Rebirth comes out next year. And Rebirth is based kind of on Final Fantasy VII. Basically not.
Right.
If anyone knows Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, it's ostensibly not the same game even remotely. But because it's based on an older game, would that then get relegated to the remake category or not? Would it be allowed for Game of the Year? And so questions like that become raised, but I think that the examples of that, or if you want to say things like RE2 and RE4 being good enough to be considered in the Game of the Year category, would it then feel lesser that they're put into the remake category instead? But those are, I think, a small enough minority of remakes in total that having the other ones referenced and mentioned for their quality in a category that does raise up games of that type, I think that pro would outweigh the con, but I think there are still some questions that would be raised by that.
Yeah. I mean, that's totally fair, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But I also think that the larger notion of this remake category makes enough sense to your point, outweigh the issues. Because I think it becomes a different thing you're praising. I think it becomes, in some ways, adapted screenplay. Yeah. Now, obviously, adapted screenplay is a weird category because, like, if you're based on a toy or, like, something somebody wrote in, like, the mud with a stick, you become adapted, right? But I think the principle can be the same of how successful did you take this. In the case of adapted screenplay, it's basically always intertextual, or that's not fair. But in a lot of cases, intertextual. Here, it's basically always same medium adaptation. But how did you adapt that, and what can you learn from that? And I think that would be a great category. But I think that the Rebirth example is a salient one in that there's really no doubt in my mind that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will be among the best games that releases next year, unless Square Enix
they
somehow
fucking- yeah.
massively fucks it, but they're not going to, because Remake is amazing. I love that game, so I have no doubt that Rebirth will be the same, and it would feel peculiar, I suppose, to say, okay, well, that's actually going to go over
exactly.
here. But I think the problem becomes then, okay, is it an equitable solution to just say, yeah, fuck it, just throw the remakes into the Game of the Year category? And here's what I think here's where I would probably cap off this part of the discussion in my own head. Last of Us Part 1, in my opinion, is of a higher quality, using quality in very many ways, a higher quality than most games that released last year. But I think that if I had been deliberating on that panel, I would have raised the ways that it's artistically successful, technically successful, the way that the game by its own merit is just extremely good. But then I also would have said, okay, but what is this pushing forward? What is sort of provocative or different or new about this? And I probably would have said not much. So I maybe would have erred on the side that the voting board did last year, saying no Part 1. But I think almost by that same metric, I might apply the same logic to RE4 and say, look, the game is exceptional. I fucking love it. It's one of the best RE games, if not the best. But what does it provide that is new, that is boundary pushing, year defining? And I would say not much. I would say that RE2, absolutely. RE2 revitalized, if Biohazard didn't before it, RE2 revitalized survival horror in the AAA space on console. So that's a very sensible nomination. But RE4, I don't know if it does. And so I suppose where I would ultimately land on this is saying, okay, remake shouldn't be a disqualification, but I think it ought to be considered what this remake in particular does to further its genre or further the notion of a remake as FF7 remake does.
Yeah, absolutely.
It pushes the genre forward with its real time and time pausing combat system. It's reimagining to a point that few remakes have reimagined in the past. Totally makes sense. RE4, I don't know. So I would consider RE4 to be on a bar of, if we're looking solely at quality, if I'm picking the 6 highest quality games from the year, I think I would probably pick RE4 as one of them. But I do feel like, and we'll probably entertain this conversation when we figure out the winner, what a Game of the Year winner should be. And to me, I do think it needs to be more than just quality. Yeah. I think there needs to be more to that to it. And I think that remake as an idea shouldn't disqualify, but it should ask you to consider more closely what's happening here. Yeah. Why is this deserving one of these 6 slots? Because I would say you can put something better in the place of RE4. Not better maybe on a pure quality to quality level, but better in a holistic way.
Yeah, the interesting thing is Resident Evil 4, I think, is the least externally nominated game for Game of the Year. Only 2 other categories, those being audio design and action adventure, which we'll talk about both of those. But I think there is something there to the fact that this is a great game, and frankly, it could have easily been nominated in more of these categories. I mean, the art direction is phenomenal, and the soundtrack is great, and the performances are good. And, like, it could have ended up in these other categories, but it didn't. And I do think that does come down to this. This is a game that, or the Game Awards are a place where usually people want to reward that newer stuff, and this is inherently less new because it's based on something that came before. But it was nominated still in 2 other categories, and the first one of those is Best Audio Design. And now we got a chance to talk about Alan Wake 2 as our first entry in this sub-series. The nominees, by the way, are Alan Wake 2, Hi-Fi Rush, Dead Space, Marvel Spider-Man 2, and Resident Evil 4. And now, the interesting thing about this category is very survival horror dominated. I would say there are 3 games here inspired by RE2 Remake. But the interesting thing about what will win here is RE4 is in a category with 2 games that do basically the exact same thing that it does in terms of its audio design. And I think that makes it pretty unlikely to win. And actually, I would say that, and this is me spitballing, but maybe just starting a little bit of a conversation about this. I think out of the 3 survival horror games nominated in audio design, I think it might be the least likely to win out of the 3 of those. Because I do think that Dead Space in the Ishimura and the Necromorphs being so distinct, there's a different kind of sound design there that people, I think, would more distinctly gravitate towards in terms of environment and sounds. And Alan Wake 2, I think, using its survival horror audio design in more artistic ways that build up its themes and synergize with the live action and things like that, that would put it above those other 2. So if I had to rank the likelihood of one of these games winning, I would say RE4 is 4th out of 5. I would say I put Spider-Man 2 probably at the bottom, but
Yeah.
I think out of the 3 survival horror games, I think it's probably last. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right. I mean, Dead Space Remake basically left no impression on me when I played it. To be honest, that's a subjective thing. I just didn't really care.
I have not tried it myself, so I cannot comment on that.
It is cool when you shoot the Necromorph's leg off. I am not going to deny that.
It's no Callisto Protocol.
Don't like
it's
that
no
game
Striking
either.
Distances Callisto Protocol. They got shut down, right?
No, but a lot of their basically all of their senior leadership left.
So basically.
So it's they should have kept Callisto Protocol in the PUBG universe.
Yep. But anyway, survival horror games, 2023.
So as we were saying, I think in the Alan Wake video, the winner of this category basically comes down to how do the people voting interpret audio design? Because I think depending on how you interpret it, Hi-Fi Rush is the very, very obvious winner. But if it's going to go to a survival horror game, the problem becomes, right, if you're not going to vote Hi-Fi Rush, you're probably voting for a survival horror game. You're probably just going to pick your poison. And frankly, the audio design is probably going to set out Timos as the one that scared you the most, and we're all going to be scared by different stuff. I found RE4 to be probably the least scary of these games. But it doesn't make the sound design bad, even though I think that it's sort of like lack of clear echolocate. It's like directional audio is what I'm looking for. The sort of lack of directional audio in RE4 doesn't work for me. I don't think it's clever.
Sure.
The game sounds great. I love hearing the chainsaw. There comes a chainsaw. But I just think the vote will get. The reality is the vote will get split between the survival horror games based on who liked which game more and voted for that, with the same rationale that they would have given it to the other survival horror game if only one had been nominated. If you see what I mean. I like Dead Space more than RE4. I'm going to vote Dead Space. If only RE4 was there, would have voted RE4 for the same reason voting Dead Space. So I think Hi-Fi Rush will probably take the category, and every survival horror heads will just piddle away their votes to different games.
The other category that I was nominated for was Best Action/Adventure Game. The nominees being Alan Wake 2, The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom, Marvel Spider-Man 2, Resident Evil 4, and Star Wars Jedi Survivor. And now, this is a category that invites a lot of interesting conversation in terms of what game genres ultimately end up being, because the experiences of playing something like Resident Evil 4 and Tears of the Kingdom could not be more different in terms of genre. But I do think that in terms of Resident Evil 4, in my eyes, being more action than horror, it's a great action game. The amount of camp and spectacle and crazy moments and crazy boss fights and doing a dodge and shooting a guy with a shotgun. This is one of the best action games I played this year, and I really love that it was nominated in this category, even though I think maybe the general sentiment might be looking at it face value that it's more of a horror game. I see it as more of an action game with its tone, so I really do love that it was nominated here.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, in my opinion, RE4 has always been more of an action game, and I think what RE4 Remake doubles down on really nicely is the renewed movement system, is the deprioritization of the knife and the increased amount of ammo, the ability to craft ammo, that changes the whole economy and moment-to-moment gameplay in a way that favors run and gun, that favors blasting through your arsenal because you know that ammo refresh is going to come for most parts of the game. I think that it works extremely well as to your point, a spectacle-driven action title. So I think its place here is absolutely deserved. I just don't think it will win.
Yeah, no, and I think that might come down to it being less new than every other game here. I mean, the action and especially the adventure side of Tears of the Kingdom, Spider-Man 2, and Jedi Survivor is nothing like Resident Evil 4. I mean, those are way bigger adventures with a greater emphasis on spectacle and variety that do make them more likely to win. And the fact that they're all not remakes, I think, does give them the edge, because even though Resident Evil 4 is a great action game, it's not a defining action game. In the way that I would say that Spider-Man 2 and Tears of the Kingdom are some of the defining action adventure games of this generation. And so I do think that it is very, 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 very unlikely that this game would win. And frankly, I'd say maybe even just because it is a remake, I think it's at the bottom of these 5 nominees in terms of likelihood.
Yeah. I also just think that you're punching against a lot of just exquisite games from the year. I mean,
that's a phenomenal
my
category.
favorite of this bunch. Yeah. I mean, my favorite of this bunch is Jedi Survivor. Jedi Survivor is also not going to win the category. But I just think that Respawn, Insomniac, Nintendo all really had this opportunity here to take what was great foundations from each of them, varying degrees of great to amazing foundations from each of them, and further that craft, right? And they did to massive, massive, massive financial success, critical success, and the scope, the polish, and everything is there. Don't come tell me that Jedi Survivor wasn't 4K 60 frames per second day one. I don't care. I just think that those 3 games in particular, the gold will fall to one of them. I don't think it's impossible, Tucker, that Star Wars Jedi Survivor takes this, just in that the game is massively popular. It's not represented really anywhere else other than performance.
Those are only 2 nominees.
So I think it will either take it or Zelda will take it. That's kind of my feeling. But I think that it's very likely that RE4 goes home without any wins.
No, I think it's basically guaranteed. I mean, we talked about each of these categories, and in each of these categories, it's either last or second to last in terms of our conversation of what is likely to win. And I don't think that's a knock against the quality of this game at all. I think that, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think it easily could have been nominated in many more categories and certainly be deserving of those aspects. And especially because I think that in terms of it being nominated for Game of the Year, there's a little bit of an iffy conversation. If it's deserved, of course, we talk about the controversy. But I do think that when you talk about art direction, or of course we talk about audio design, or performances, or score, or maybe not narrative so much, it would fit in these categories, and people wouldn't be like, oh, it doesn't have great art direction, because it does, and it also has substantially different art direction. So I'm not surprised that it didn't get as many nominations as it did, because again, I do think the stigma of it being a remake does hold it back from being nominated, or it has lower priority or preference versus things that really innovated in that field. But it's a phenomenally quality game, and the fact that it's not nominated for much and it's not winning much is really just a symptom of this being a great year, and each of these categories being packed and stacked. And easily you can see if Resident Evil 4 came out last year, it being nominated for a lot more stuff in a year that was a little bit lighter in terms of those biggest quality game releases. But it's another phenomenal game in the year of phenomenal games, and so it got pushed to the side. But unlike some of these other games, it did squeak in the gold. I mean, Hi-Fi Rush is nominated for 7 things, and this is nominated for 2 outside of Game of the Year. But it still got into Game of the Year, which I think does show that while there is the controversy of it being a remake, ultimately people don't care. And it's a great game that was one of the best games of the year. And in their eyes, it did things different enough, as opposed to something like Part 2 or Metroid Prime Remastered, where it does deserve to be amongst those 6 nominees. Lots of people voted for it, and it got in to the top 6 games of the Game of the Year nominees from the Game Awards.
Tucker, I look forward to reinvigorating this conversation, and my favorite game of next year is Last of Us Part 2 Remastered.
Oh, that's a good... I mean, hey, it's probably going to be the best game of next year.
Bingo time, or whatever he
wait,
says.
Wait, go on bingo.
I forgot I gave so there must be a bingo night or whatever. I don't remember. What did it say about the cow?
There's a cow line?
Something about the cow.
Resident Evil 4 cow line. Resident.
Yeah, look up RA4 cow line. Maybe the cow line is also about
Cow line?
Yeah, look up cow
quote.
RE4 cow quote. This is famous.
Flaming cow?
Yeah.
Cow head? Hold on.
Yeah. Flaming. What's the line? Oh my goodness, a flaming cow. What will they think of next? I believe that's the quote.
This YouTube short was no help. He talked over the quote. I have no idea.
It's not important. A little homework for the audience. Go figure out what the cow quote is and report back.